The rejection hit harder than any boardroom defeat Edward had ever faced. "You're dead to us now." His father's voice cracked over the speakerphone like a whip, while Edward stood frozen in the penthouse kitchen, gripping Bryan's hand so tightly their knuckles turned white. Bryan didn't flinch. He simply squeezed back, offering the only anchor Edward had left in a world that had just collapsed around him. At 31, Edward had been groomed since birth to inherit the multi-billion-dollar tech empire his grandfather built in Silicon Valley. The sterling name meant power, private jets, and a legacy that demanded perfection, especially the kind that came with a society wife and 2.5 heirs. Falling in love with another man had never been part of the plan. Yet here he was 2 days before the wedding of the century, watching his entire future evaporate because he refused to let Bryan go. It had started innocently enough 3 years earlier at a charity gala in San Francisco. Edward was there to represent sterling dynamics, shaking hands and writing six-figure checks while secretly counting down the minutes until he could escape the suffocating small talk. Bryan had been hired as the event photographer, a quiet 30-year-old with warm hazel eyes and a camera strap slung across his shoulder like a badge of honor. Their first conversation happened when Bryan accidentally backed into Edward while framing a shot of the glittering skyline. "Sorry, man, didn't see you there." Bryan laughed, and something in that easy, genuine sound cracked the armor Edward had worn his entire adult life. They talked for 20 minutes about light angles and impossible dreams before Bryan snapped a candid photo of Edward laughing for the first time in months. That photo still sat on Edward's nightstand, a reminder that real connection could happen in the middle of a crowded ballroom. The months that followed were stolen moments. Late-night drives along the Pacific Coast Highway, where Bryan taught Edward how to skip stones, and Edward showed Bryan the secret rooftop garden atop his office building. They kept it quiet at first because Edward knew the rules. His mother's weekly brunches, her pointed questions about that nice girl from Yale, his father's golf buddies who bragged about their sons' engagements. Edward told himself it was just a phase until the night Bryan looked at him across a candlelit table in a tiny Italian restaurant in North Beach and said, "I'm in love with you, and I'm not going anywhere." The words landed like truth Edward had been running from his whole life. He had spent years burying the part of himself that felt different, pretending the emptiness was normal. Bryan made the emptiness disappear. But secrets have expiration dates. 6 months ago, Edward's sister caught them kissing in the family's Napa vineyard during a supposed business retreat. The fallout was immediate. His mother cried for days. His father issued ultimatums. "Fix this, or you're out." Edward tried to explain that loving Bryan didn't make him less of a son, less of a leader, less of anything. The words bounced off years of conditioning. So he made the only choice that felt honest. He proposed on the same rooftop where their friendship had first deepened, sliding a simple platinum band onto Bryan's finger under a sky full of stars. Bryan said yes with tears in his eyes, and for one perfect moment, the future looked possible. Now that future was burning. Edward stared at the phone his father had already hung up on. The silence in the penthouse felt heavier than any boardroom verdict. Bryan pulled him into a hug, pressing his forehead to Edward's. "We don't need them," he whispered, but Edward heard the tremor beneath the strength. Bryan had grown up in a one-bedroom apartment in Oakland, raised by a single mother who worked double shifts at the hospital. He understood rejection in a way Edward never had until today. Together, they had built something real, a life of Sunday farmers markets, quiet evenings, editing Bryan's photos, and dreams of opening a small gallery together. Edward had already quietly transferred assets, started his own venture capital firm away from the sterling name. But the emotional cut still sliced deep. That night, they sat on the balcony overlooking the bay, sharing a bottle of wine Bryan had saved for their engagement. "Tell me again why we're doing this," Edward said, half joking. Bryan smiled softly, tracing the ring on his finger. "Because love isn't a business deal. It's the only thing worth losing everything for." Edward felt the truth settle in his bones. Tomorrow they would face the world without the safety net of his family's approval. But tonight, with Bryan's head on his shoulder and the city lights twinkling below, he realized he had already won the only thing that mattered. The wedding was still happening, and nothing, not even the sterling empire, could stop two men who had finally found the courage to be exactly who they were. The morning after the phone call, Edward woke to the sound of Bryan humming in the kitchen, the smell of fresh coffee cutting through the lingering ache in his chest. He padded barefoot across the cool marble floor and wrapped his arms around Bryan from behind, pressing a kiss to the nape of his neck. "Still time to elope to Bali," Bryan teased, turning in his embrace. Edward laughed, but the sound felt fragile. They both knew running wasn't an option. The wedding invitations had already gone out to 300 guests, many of them Edward's business associates, who had quietly begun distancing themselves once rumors spread. The tabloids were already circling with headlines like "Sterling Heir's Secret Gay Affair Rocks Tech Royalty." Edward had expected the gossip. He hadn't expected the emptiness of being erased from his own family tree overnight. His mother's text arrived while they were reviewing seating charts. "Your father and I will not attend. Please remove us from all records. We wish you the best in your choices." The words were polite, clinical, and they cut deeper than any shouting match. Edward stared at the screen until Bryan gently took the phone from his hand. "She's scared," Bryan said quietly. "Doesn't make it hurt less." They spent the day finalizing details with their wedding planner, a fierce woman named Carla, who had become a surrogate big sister to them both. The venue was a private estate in Big Sur, perched on cliffs above the Pacific with infinity pools and gardens that looked like they belonged in a dream. Edward had spared no expense, because if this was going to be their declaration to the world, it needed to feel like victory, not compromise. That afternoon, they met with their closest friends at a small rehearsal dinner in the city. Marcus, Edward's college roommate, and the only person from his old life who had never wavered, sat beside his husband Jamal. "You're doing the bravest thing I've ever seen," Marcus told Edward over glasses of champagne. But even Marcus carried tension in his shoulders. Later in the restroom, he confessed that Edward's father had called him, personally offering a lucrative consulting contract if he could talk some sense into the groom. The betrayal stung, but Edward only nodded. "Let them try. I'm done letting their money define me." Bryan overheard and pulled Edward aside under the string lights. "You're already more of a man than they'll ever understand." Their kiss was soft and grounding, the kind that reminded Edward why every sacrifice felt worth it. The next morning brought the first real test. Edward's younger brother Logan showed up unannounced at the penthouse, looking every inch the reluctant messenger in his tailored suit. "Dad says if you call off the wedding, he'll reinstate you. Full heir status. No questions." Logan's eyes flicked nervously to Bryan, who stood quietly in the doorway. Edward felt the old pull of a lifetime of wanting to make his father proud. But then he looked at Bryan, the man who had taught him that pride could come from within, and the answer crystallized. "Tell him the wedding is still on. And tell him I hope one day he understands what he's throwing away." Logan left without another word, but the encounter left Edward shaken. That night, nightmares of empty boardrooms and his mother's disappointed face woke him gasping. Bryan held him through it, whispering stories from his own childhood about learning to stand tall when the world tried to push you down. As the final preparations accelerated, Edward threw himself into work at his new firm, Sterling No Longer. He closed a major deal with a clean energy startup, the kind of forward-thinking investment his father had always dismissed. The victory felt hollow without family to share it with, yet Bryan celebrated like it was the Super Bowl, ordering takeout and dancing around the living room until they both collapsed laughing. In those quiet moments, Edward saw the future. They were building one where love wasn't a liability, but the foundation. The Disowned papers arrived via courier the next day, officially severing him from the family trust. He signed them with steady hands while Bryan watched from across the table. "Ready for tomorrow?" Bryan asked. Edward met his gaze, and for the first time in weeks the answer came without hesitation. "I've never been more ready in my life." The morning of the wedding dawned clear and impossibly blue over Big Sur, as if the Pacific itself had decided to bless the day. Edward stood on the private balcony of the cliffside suite, adjusting his cufflinks while Bryan finished getting ready in the next room. The air smelled of salt and eucalyptus, and for the first time since the Disowned, Edward felt something close to peace. Below them, the venue was transforming into a fairy tale. White roses cascaded down every archway, crystal chandeliers swayed gently in the breeze, and a string quartet rehearsed softly near the altar. 300 guests were already arriving, friends, colleagues, and chosen family who had chosen them over the sterling fortune. Yet Edward's eyes kept drifting toward the empty seats reserved for his parents, the ones he knew would remain vacant. Bryan stepped onto the balcony, looking devastating in his tailored midnight blue tuxedo. "You're staring," he teased, slipping his arms around Edward's waist. They stood like that for a long moment, watching the waves crash far below. "I keep thinking they'll show up," Edward admitted. Bryan nodded, understanding without needing more words. Their relationship had been forged in these honest conversations, the ones where fear and hope tangled together. Over the past year, Bryan had become more than a partner. He had become Edward's compass, teaching him that identity wasn't something to hide, but something to celebrate. Together, they had attended their first Pride Parade in San Francisco, where Edward marched openly for the first time, feeling both terrified and liberated. They had faced awkward dinner parties where old friends asked too many questions, and quiet nights where Edward cried over childhood memories that no longer fit who he was becoming. A soft knock interrupted them. Carla, the planner, poked her head in. 10 minutes, gentlemen. The guests are seated, and the press is behaving for once." Edward took Bryan's hand, and they walked together down the flower-lined path toward the altar. The guests rose as the music swelled, and Edward felt every eye on them, but the only gaze that mattered was Bryan's. Vows had been written in secret late-night sessions over too much coffee. When Edward's turn came, he spoke clearly, his voice carrying across the cliffs. "Bryan, you saw me when I was too afraid to see myself. You taught me that love isn't weakness, it's the greatest strength I'll ever have. Today I choose you not just for the easy days, but for every storm we'll weather together." Bryan's eyes shone as he replied, "Edward, you gave me a family I never knew I could have. I promise to stand beside you through every doubt, every triumph, and every sunrise we're lucky enough to share." The kiss that sealed their union was gentle and profound, the kind that made several guests wipe away tears. As they walked back down the aisle hand in hand, Edward caught sight of Marcus and Jamal cheering louder than anyone. Later at the reception, under a canopy of twinkling lights, Bryan pulled him onto the dance floor for their first dance as husbands. The song was the same indie track that had played during their first road trip, and Edward felt the weight of the past year lift with every step. Friends toasted to new beginnings, and Edward's new business partner pulled him aside to whisper that the clean energy deal had just attracted major investors. Success was finding him on his own terms. Yet the evening carried undercurrents. A few guests whispered about the missing Sterling family, and Edward overheard one distant cousin muttering about throwing away a legacy. He chose to ignore it, focusing instead on the joy radiating from Bryan's face as they cut the 5-tier cake decorated with edible gold and fresh berries. When the cake was served, Bryan fed Edward a bite with playful ceremony, and the crowd erupted in applause. In that moment, surrounded by people who loved them for who they were, Edward realized the family he had lost had been replaced by something stronger. The night stretched on with laughter, stories, and dancing until the stars wheeled overhead. As the last guest departed, Edward and Bryan stood on the cliff edge, watching the moon rise over the water. "We did it," Bryan whispered. Edward kissed his temple, knowing the real journey was only beginning. The world outside still held judgment, and the family that had cast him out still lingered in his heart like an open wound. But tonight, with Bryan's ring on his finger and the future stretching bright before them, Edward felt ready for whatever came next. The honeymoon in Santorini lasted 2 weeks of sun-soaked bliss, but reality crashed back the moment their private jet touched down in San Francisco. Edward's phone flooded with notifications. His former company, Sterling Dynamics, had issued a press release distancing itself from personal matters, and several major clients had quietly pulled contracts citing values alignment. The financial hit was manageable. Edward's new firm was already turning heads in venture capital circles, but the emotional toll was heavier. Bryan noticed, immediately setting aside his own photography projects to help Edward navigate the fallout. "We rebuild together," he said simply, and those words became their mantra through endless strategy meetings and late-night planning sessions. 6 months later, Edward's company closed its first nine-figure round of funding. The clean energy startup he had backed early was now valued at over $1 billion, and suddenly the tech world was buzzing about the renegade Sterling. Articles appeared praising his vision while subtly digging into the family rift. Edward gave interviews carefully avoiding drama, but the questions always circled back to his marriage. "Love made me a better leader," he would say, and Bryan would smile proudly from the sidelines. Their life together settled into a rhythm that felt both ordinary and extraordinary. Morning runs along the Embarcadero, shared meals in their new loft downtown, and quiet evenings where Bryan developed photos in his home darkroom, while Edward reviewed pitch decks. They had chosen the loft together, painting the walls themselves, laughing when Edward got more paint on Bryan than on the drywall. Friendships deepened in unexpected ways. Jamal introduced them to a tight-knit group of LGBTQ entrepreneurs who became their chosen family, hosting monthly dinners where stories of struggle and triumph flowed freely. Yet not every bridge remained intact. One evening, an old college friend named Derek reached out, asking to meet for drinks. Edward went alone, hoping for reconciliation, only to discover Derek had been paid by his father to gather information about the wedding and Edward's new business. The betrayal burned hot. "I thought we were better than this," Edward said quietly before walking away. That night, he came home to Bryan and broke down in a way he hadn't allowed himself since the disownment. Bryan held him without judgment, reminding him that real loyalty didn't come with price tags. The experience hardened Edward, but it also clarified his path. He doubled down on mentorship programs for young queer professionals, funneling resources into scholarships and startup incubators that his own family would have dismissed as soft. Meanwhile, Bryan's career blossomed. His photography series capturing LGBTQ love stories across America caught the eye of a major gallery in New York. The opening night exhibit drew crowds and critics alike, with one portrait of Edward laughing in the vineyard becoming the centerpiece. Standing beside Bryan under the gallery lights, Edward felt a surge of pride that had nothing to do with money. Their life was no longer defined by what they had lost, but by what they were creating. Still, the past refused to stay buried. Edward's mother began sending occasional emails, short, carefully worded notes about her garden or the weather. He replied politely, but kept distance, sensing the olive branch was fragile at best. Bryan encouraged him to keep the door open just a crack. "Healing isn't linear," he said, and Edward trusted that wisdom because Bryan had walked through his own fires of acceptance long before they met. As their first anniversary approached, they planned a quiet celebration, just the two of them back in Big Sur, where it all began. The drive up the coast felt like coming full circle. They stopped at the same roadside stand for fresh strawberries and laughed, remembering their first awkward date. At the Cliffside estate, they renewed their vows, privately exchanging new rings engraved with coordinates of the places that mattered most. That night, under a blanket of stars, Edward confessed the fear that still lingered, the worry that he had traded one family for another and might one day regret it. Bryan listened, then pulled him close. "You didn't trade anything. You chose yourself, and I get to love that man every single day." The words settled something deep inside Edward. The journey had tested them, broken them open, and rebuilt them stronger. Whatever came next, family reconciliation, business battles, or quiet domestic joys, they would face it side by side. The invitation arrived on heavy cream stationery embossed with the sterling crest. Edward stared at it for a full minute before showing Bryan. "They want us at the annual family gala," he said, voice flat. Bryan read the short note from Edward's mother inviting them as honored guests and suggesting it was time to move forward. The timing felt deliberate, coming just weeks after Edward's firm was named one of Forbes' fastest-growing companies. Bryan set the card down carefully. "This is your call, love. But whatever you decide, I'm right beside you." Edward spent 3 sleepless nights weighing the risks. Part of him wanted closure, another part feared fresh wounds. In the end, curiosity and a lingering hope for healing won out. They accepted with a simple RSVP and began preparing for what promised to be the most awkward evening of their married life. The gala was held at the family's sprawling estate in Hillsborough, the same mansion where Edward had grown up riding bikes on manicured lawns and learning that emotions were best kept behind closed doors. Pulling up in their modest electric SUV felt surreal next to the fleet of luxury cars. Valets stared openly as Edward helped Bryan out, both men dressed in matching charcoal suits with subtle rainbow pin accents. Inside, the ballroom chandeliers sparkled over crystal and conversation, but the moment they entered, the temperature seemed to drop. Whispers followed them like shadows. Edward's father stood near the bar, his face a mask of controlled surprise. His mother approached, first her smile tight, but genuine. "You look well, Edward." The hug was brief, awkward, yet it happened. Bryan extended his hand politely, and to everyone's shock, Edward's mother took it. "Thank you for coming," she said softly. The evening unfolded in layers of tension and tentative connection. Edward's sister pulled him aside near the dessert table, her eyes glistening. "I've missed you. Dad's been impossible since everything." She admitted the company had lost key talent after Edward's departure, and several board members had questioned the family's direction. Bryan, meanwhile, charmed a group of younger cousins, sharing stories from his photography travels. One cousin, a college freshman, quietly confessed she had come out to her parents the month before, inspired by Edward's courage. Small moments like these chipped away at the wall Edward had built around his heart. Yet the real test came when his father cornered him on the terrace overlooking the gardens. "Your mother convinced me to invite you," he admitted gruffly. "The company isn't the same without your vision." Edward waited, expecting demands or conditions. Instead, his father added, "I was wrong about a lot of things, son. Seeing you tonight happy, it's made me think." The admission hung between them, fragile as spun glass. Edward didn't forgive on the spot, but he nodded. "I'm happy, Dad. Really happy. And I built that without the name." Later, Bryan found him staring at the stars. "How are you holding up?" Edward turned, pulling his husband close. "Better than I expected. There's still a long way to go, but tonight felt like the first step." They danced together on the edge of the crowd, ignoring the stares, and for the first time in years, Edward felt the family he was born into and the family he chose beginning to overlap in small, beautiful ways. The drive home was quiet, reflective. Bryan rested his hand on Edward's knee as the city lights appeared on the horizon. "Whatever happens, next we've already won the important part." Edward smiled, knowing it was true. The gala had reopened doors he thought permanently sealed, yet the real victory remained the life they had carved together, one filled with love, authenticity, and the quiet strength that came from choosing each other every single day. 2 years later, Edward stood on the stage of a sold-out conference hall in downtown San Francisco, accepting an award for innovation in sustainable technology. The room erupted in applause as he thanked his team, his investors, and finally his husband Bryan, sitting in the front row beaming with pride. In his speech, Edward spoke openly about the journey that had shaped him, the family that had let him go, and the one that had welcomed him back on new terms. His parents now attended quarterly dinners at the loft, sometimes bringing homemade pie from his mother's kitchen. The reconciliation remained imperfect, conversations still carried careful pauses, but love, stubborn and patient, had begun to bridge the gap. Bryan's gallery show in New York had led to a book deal, and together they had launched a foundation supporting LGBTQ youth in tech and arts. Life felt full in ways Edward had never imagined possible. Yet on quiet evenings when the city hummed below their windows, Edward still reflected on the night. Everything changed. He would trace the lines on Bryan's sleeping face and wonder at the courage it took to choose love over legacy. Their story had rippled outward, inspiring colleagues, friends, and even strangers who reached out via social media, sharing their own journeys of acceptance and growth. The lavish wedding that once divided a family had become a symbol of what was possible when two people refused to hide. As Edward turned off the light and pulled Bryan closer, he felt the profound peace that comes from living truthfully. The road had been long marked by sacrifice, misunderstanding, and hard-won triumphs, but every step had led them here to a love that had not only survived but flourished. True or false? The family's regret stemmed purely from watching Edward's independent success rather than from losing the chance to know the man he truly became through love.